just ever so slightly. We can do these little S-turns on final here to help us lose the altitude we need to. Staying coordinated the whole time, these little S-turns, managing airspeed and altitude. That's what it's all about, folks. That's the name of the game.
Hey everybody, welcome back. Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut, and Happy New Year to all of you out there. I hope you had a great holiday season. We are kicking off the new year this year with our Power Off 180 deep dive, and I've been looking forward to this for a while now. I put out a post on YouTube a few weeks ago, a month ago, whatever time ago, and I asked you if I was going to do this video of this Power Off 180 deep dive, which airplane would you like to see it done in? And the options were our Skyhawk Cessna 172, our Cessna 150, or our RV-12. And the majority of you said the Skyhawk Cessna 172, so that's what we did. Now today we're going to be getting into the nitty-gritty of the Power Off 180, talking specifically about the 3 tools we have when it comes to energy management and how we can use those to perform this maneuver accurately every time. And this is a critical skill that we all need to have when it does come to an engine out scenario. If you flying along and you lose your engine, there might only be very limited spots available to you to land. And being able to manage that energy without any additional power and set that aircraft down in that specific spot is critical for every pilot. So let's review the 3 tools we have when it comes to energy management. We have the geometry of our approach, forward slips, and flaps. All right. And in general, while all airplanes are a little different, I like to use those tools in that order, saving flaps kind of as our last resort. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. So let's start with the geometry of our approach. What is the geometry of our approach? Well, for the purpose of this maneuver, we are generally pulling our power to idle when we are abeam the numbers or abeam our landing spot, okay? And then it's basically up to us to fly the pattern, the rest of our downwind, base, and final leg to set that airplane down where we need it to be. But when we don't have an engine and we don't have that additional power available to us, we don't need to necessarily fly the standard squared off pattern that we usually do. We can round corners. We can take straight line paths from where we are to the runway if necessary. We can even do some S-turns to help lose altitude as needed. All right, so the geometry of our approach, while it's inherent in every approach we make, no matter what, there are ways we can use it that are a little bit outside the norm in order to achieve this maneuver successfully. Now, talking about forward slips. Forward slips, you've known since private pilot training, a very versatile maneuver. I love forward slips because they can be put in and they can be taken out at will. You can do a little bit of slip. You can do a lot of bit of slip. All right, but the nice thing is that when you put the slip in, it's going to take away energy. Okay, it's going to help slow you down and it's going to help bring you down. But as soon as you take that slip out, that energy not only basically comes back, but you almost might feel like you get a boost of energy, all right? So you have a lot of control over how much energy you are kind of siphoning away from the plane based on how much slip you use, all right? So a very versatile tool, and it can be held and used all the way down until you're right over the runway if necessary. All right, so let's talk about flaps. Flaps, great tool, but I always teach to reserve and only use them as necessary, if necessary. The reason for that is when we put flaps in, first of all, we only have a certain amount of flaps, right? It's a finite amount. That might be different from one plane to another, but ultimately it's a finite amount of flaps. When you put flaps in, we lose energy, okay? Flaps are traditionally meant to help slow us down and bring us down. So they are good at that. But when we take flaps out, we also end up losing energy, particularly in the form of altitude, because we need to then gain airspeed. We lose lift in the process. We have to gain airspeed back. And in order to do that, we lose altitude. So you're losing energy of some sort on both sides of that coin when we use flaps, both when you put flaps in and when you take them out. So as a result, we generally don't take them out once we put them in. They're kind of a one and done. You put them in, you're kind of stuck with them. There is an exception to that, which we're going to discuss. But if you put them in too early, there's not much you can do. If you put too much in too early and you come in short, you're kind of in a pickle. So we want to reserve flaps for only if and when we need them. But the other side of that is that flaps can also be used not only to slow us down and bring us down, but to actually help extend our glide. So if we haven't used all of our flaps, perhaps especially if we haven't used any flaps yet, when we're coming in over the runway, if we feel like, oh, we're getting a little slow, we're getting a little low, I might not make it. A little bump of flaps, especially from 0 to 10 degrees in a 172, will give you primarily lift. Very little drag, mostly lift, and it'll give you a nice bump, which you can use to get to your spot, okay? Same thing for 20 degrees. 20 degrees kind of gives you equal amounts of lift and drag. 30 degrees and beyond, it's primarily drag, very, very little lift, but it still can be used in a very specific pinch if necessary. So that's one way we can also use flaps. But again, if you've used all your flaps already to come down, you don't have that option anymore. You have no more flaps to put in to help extend that glide. And then finally, when it does come to taking flaps out, if you have 10 or even 20 degrees of flaps in as you come in over your runway, if you find yourself floating too far, maybe you still have a little bit too much energy, you can pull those flaps out at the last second, and that will take away a whole bunch of lift, allow that airplane to come down right on your spot. Now, this does take practice. It does take finesse, and you're going to want to definitely practice with a CFI before you do it by yourself because, as we know in a Cessna, when we put flaps in, we get a pitching up moment of the nose, right? So when we take flaps out, that nose wants to fall. So it is a balance. When you take those flaps out at the last second there, you have to hold that nose up to make sure you don't drop that nose into the ground, okay? Because that could end badly. So it is something to practice, and there are ways that I do practice that with students. But they can be a versatile tool, but a little bit more complex to use, and definitely something you don't want to just dump in all at once too early on in the process. So today we're going to be doing Power Off 180 3 times, 3 different ways, layering on these tools. All right, we're going to start with one Power Off 180 where we only use the geometry of our approach. No flaps, no forward slips, okay? Then the second one, we're going to add in the tool of forward slips. So we'll use the geometry of our approach with a forward slip. And then finally, we'll do the geometry of our approach with forward slips, with flaps, okay? You're going to see in these videos that I change my aiming point each time. And this is something I recommend everyone to do because if you get too used to aiming for the same point on the runway, it can almost become a little bit of a crutch, okay? So if you are always using the 1,000-footers, I encourage you to move it around, okay? So here we're going to be using the 3rd stripe of the center line for our first Power Off 180. Then we're going to move to the 2nd stripe, then to the 1st stripe, okay? One more note before we get into the cockpit here. One technique I use, so many people, when they do the Power Off 180, they'll pull the power and they'll immediately go to best glide speed. I have never taught that. I've never done that. I typically like going 10 knots or so over best glide. And the reason for that is, think about this. What does best glide do for us? Well, it allows us to glide further, All right. Now, in a power off 180 situation, do we need to glide further? No, because we are pulling our power, beam our numbers. Like we are literally right next to the point that we want to land. We don't need to glide further. We have plenty of altitude already to get to where we need to go. Gliding further is only going to force you to have to go further away from your runway before you come back to it. And the last thing we want to do in any type of engine out scenario is go further away from where we're trying to land, because that's when you accidentally end up too far, too low, and too slow, and things end badly. So I initially pitched for 10 over, best glide. I get into a position where I know I have the runway made, and then I slow down to a more appropriate approach speed. But what this allows me to do is if I am 10 knots faster than best glide generally, and I find myself getting too far away by accident, I still have 10 knots of airspeed I can bleed off and help extend my glide to help get me back. But if I'm already at best glide and I get too far away or too low, there's nothing I can do. It's done. Okay, I'm just stuck. So I always pitch for 10 over initially. In this case, you'll see me pitching and trimming for 75 knots. And then as I turn base and I am no longer traveling away from my runway, that is when I will start slowing down, which will also help me come down and get to a more appropriate final approach speed. All right, guys, so we're going to jump into the cockpit here where we are going to be doing our first power off 180 utilizing only the geometry of our approach.
All right, everybody. Power off 180 deep dives today. We're doing a lot of power off 180s. And we're starting with our first tool of the geometry of our approach. Here we go, taking off. All right, airspeed's alive. Everything's green. Engine's making good power. Looking for 55. There's 55, rotate. Abort point continuing. So the geometry of our approach being the first tool that we want to use, and while it's really inherent in every power off 180, like you can't do one without using the geometry of your approach, there are certain ways you could use it above and beyond what might be considered normal in order to achieve the proper energy management. That might include extending downwind, it might include extending base and overshooting final, or doing some S-turns on final. So we'll see what we need to do today. In order to hit our spot, we're going to be aiming for the third stripe today, the third stripe. Here we go, pulling our power. Third stripe, pitching for 75 initially. Remember, I like to pitch for 10 over best glide. All right, pitching and trimming for 75. Not using flaps, not using forward slips. This is strictly using the geometry of our approach, and it is by far the hardest method of doing a power off 180 because you're taking away 2 out of your 3 tools. Traffic 658 left base, 02 left. Alright, so I'm looking for that third stripe. We can start slowing down now. We've got our runway made. We can start slowing down, which will also help us come down. Alright, so I'm going to overshoot final just ever so slightly. We can do these little S-turns on final here to help us lose the altitude we need to. Staying coordinated the whole time, these little S-turns, managing airspeed and altitude. That's what it's all about, folks. That's the name of the game. All right, we're coming down. Traffic 658 final 02 front. Now I need to slow down some more. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to get down low pretty early because I have a lot of airspeed and I'm going to need time to bleed this airspeed off. So that's what I'm doing. I got down early. That way I can use the time to bleed the airspeed off and fly it. I'm flying it to this third stripe. I'm flying it to this third stripe. I'm flying it to the third stripe and letting it come down right there. All right. So that is how we can use the geometry of our approach for energy management in a Power Off 180.
All right, guys, so there you have it. Power Off 180 utilizing only the geometry of our approach. And you could see that we were using those S-turns to lose that altitude. And then at the end there, I noticed, I was still high and I had too much energy. So what I did is I put that nose down and I dived down early, intentionally, because by diving down, I know I'm going to gain more energy. I'm going to gain more airspeed. But if I can do it early enough in the process, get down, gain a little bit of energy that I ultimately don't want, but am trading that altitude for the airspeed, then I can level off in level flight, which will give me time to bleed off that airspeed and ultimately set the airplane down where I want it to be. If I had not done that, if I had waited and just kept coming in, I would have kept too much energy too far into the approach. I would have floated right past my point. Okay, so that's another kind of tool you can use in almost a vertical geometry to trade energy and know that you'll have enough time to bleed it off. All right, next we're going to jump back into the cockpit where we're adding our second tool, our forward slips. Okay, so we're going to be utilizing the geometry of our approach in addition to our forward slips here. Let's get going.
Got my buddy Miguel here. Shout out to Miguel for helping me with the ground footage you're seeing in this video. Did an excellent job. Thank you, Miguel. All right, guys. Welcome back to the cockpit. Power Off 180, number 2, we're adding our second tool into the mix, which is our forward slips. Forward slips are great because you can put them in and take them out. You can put them in a little bit. You can put them in a lot. But once you take them out, you're not losing any more energy. You put them in, you lose energy. You take them out, you, if anything, gain energy back. So forward slips are an excellent, versatile tool. So we're going to utilize the geometry of our approach with forward slips. We are aiming for the second stripe today, folks. Second stripe on this one. Here we go. Car beat's coming out. Power is going to idle. Second stripe. All right, pitching for 75. Pitching and trimming for 75. There we go. All right, second stripe, utilizing both the geometry of our approach as well as forward slips. Traffic 65813, left base 02, turn up. All right, so I've turned base. I know I have the runway made, so I can start slowing down to a more appropriate approach speed. Trimming that nose up, keeping that airspeed down. As we turn final, I'm going to keep my left wing down, and I'm just going to add right rudder. Traffic 65813, final 02, turn up. There we go, I'm adding right rudder to add this slip in. Bringing the plane down. Still utilizing the geometry of my approach as necessary, but this is keeping my airspeed down, reducing the amount of energy I have so that I can get it on that second stripe. And I can take it in and out as necessary. I don't have to keep it in, and I don't need to keep it completely out. I've got a lot of versatility with it. All right, second stripe coming in. We're flying it to that second stripe. We're flying it to that second stripe. We're flying it to that second stripe. We're flying it. We're flying it. There we go. Right on that second stripe. All right. So that is the Power Off 180 with your geometry of your approach and forward slips.
All right, so there you have it, our forward slip, Power Off 180 to the second stripe. And you could see that I was kind of just easing that forward slip in and out. You can use it just a little bit. You can use it a lot. You only hold it as much as you feel you need to. Sometimes you might be holding it all the way down, even into the round out over the runway. But in general, if you use it early enough, you shouldn't have to hold it that long. You can get into a point or to a spot where you're at an appropriate glide slope to the runway, and you land right on your spot. Okay? So that was Power Off 180 number 2. Finally, we're going to jump into the cockpit where we are utilizing all 3 tools: the geometry of our approach, forward slips, and flaps. All right, let's go ahead and jump in the cockpit and we'll get going with this one.
All right, guys, Power Off 180 with all 3 tools available to us this time: geometry of our approach, forward slips, and flaps. Now remember, flaps are always the last thing we want to resort to, because the thing with flaps is when you put them in, you lose energy. However, when you take them out, you also lose energy. So it's a double negative. Now that can be used to your advantage, but it can also bite you if you're not careful with it. So they're always the last thing we use. The other reason why we use them last is because flaps can be used for the normal purpose of slowing us down and bringing us down, but they can also be used in the right way to extend your glide. If you are coming in short, you can add some flaps in, especially 10 degrees and even 20, to extend your glide, all right? They can also, if you have a little bit of flaps in, be used if you find yourself floating too far. You can pull them out last second to lose a bunch of lift and let that plane come right down on the spot. All right, guys, here we go. We're aiming for the first stripe today. First stripe. Pitching for 75, trimming for 75. Watching my runway, looking at that first stripe. That's where we're going to set down. All right, I'm turning base here.
Traffic 5813 left base 0220.
Now, I don't need flaps yet, but I'm going to put in 10 degrees, okay? And I'm going to do that because as we come in over that first stripe, it gives me an extra tool. Like I said, if I find myself going too far, I can bring those flaps out. It'll take away a bunch of lift and I'll come right down where I want to be. So sometimes you can put them in even if you don't need them, just to give yourself that extra tool once you're over your spot. All right.
Traffic 5813 final 0220.
Burning just a little bit of a rounded final, just a tiny, tiny overshoot, and do a little bit of a slip here. Couple little S-turns, bringing it down towards that first stripe. Got a lot of energy still. All right, got a lot of energy. We're looking good, coming down for the first stripe. And I'm gonna pull the flaps out right before I get over that second or that first stripe so that I come right down on it. Here we go, coming in, and make sure I hold the nose up while I do this. Here we go, flaps coming out, holding that nose up, coming right down. There we are. All right, guys, that was how flaps can be used in a Power Off 180. I hope you found that helpful. 3 tools, guys: geometry of your approach, forward slips, and flaps. Use them in that order. You'll hit it every time.
All right, guys, there you have it. So you saw there at the very end, I put 10 degrees of flaps in kind of on the base leg. Even though I didn't need it, I could have still used the geometry of my approach and slips to get me down. But I added that 10 degrees of flaps to almost kind of load the gun a little bit, right? I loaded a bullet in there so that I had that available when I got over my runway, so that I could fire that off, take the flaps out, and allow the plane to come down. If I don't have the flaps in there, and I come in over the runway with too much energy, there's nothing I can really do at that point to lose the energy. But if I have those flaps kind of loaded up, then I can throw those out, get rid of that energy, and come right down where I need to be. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found this video helpful. Leave me some comments down below if you have any questions, and share this with anyone you think would find it helpful as well. Have a great rest of your day, and until next time, resume your own navigation. See ya.